Good morning, ladies. Today, we begin dealing with the practical aspects of living the Christian life. You know, we've spent months and months building up our knowledge of God through the study. During the quarantine period, we looked at 10 attributes of God. Now, those 10 attributes were the ones that are unique to Him. They are not the ones that He shares with us. But studying those 10 attributes of God were just so important and are so important for helping us to understand ourselves. Because as we look at God, we see what we are not. And then, since then, when we did those attributes, when we opened up and met together again in June, we've been in the book of Colossians. And we spent a lot of time looking in those first two chapters of Colossians at the Exalted Christ. That's actually what we named the series, the Exalted Christ. So as we've studied who God is, who Christ is, and eventually we're going to study who the Holy Spirit is, we are just blown away by the incredible power that you and I possess as Christians because the exalted Christ indwells us. Think about that. The power that raised Jesus from the dead resides inside of each and every born-again Christian. Now, that power is there for a very specific purpose. It's to give us power to live this life. Living the Christian life is becoming more and more difficult in some aspects because of our culture that is becoming so anti-God. But even in our own homes, dealing with the temptations of life at home and at work, those are difficulties we face as believers because we're to be unique. We are image bearers of Jesus Christ, and so it's becoming more and more difficult to be true to that image. And what Paul is doing in Colossians 3 is now tackling some of the specific worldly areas that we deal with, from how to deal with sin, what is the family like, what is the marriage like, what is the parenting like, what is the workplace like. And so we're taking, or Paul is taking us from the theological and the doctrinal teachings of the knowledge of God and the knowledge of Christ, and that knowledge should incredibly equip us for living the life that he's now going to talk about. So I hope that helps you understand what we're, the kind of the big picture and overview of the book of Colossians. Now, 2 weeks ago, we looked at verses 1 through 4 in Colossians 3. And let me read that again because I just want to touch on it briefly as a backdrop or a foundation for what we're going to be looking at today. Paul says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, or since then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on the things that are on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." So he's saying that because we have been raised with Christ, because we are new creations, because we have been born again, we are to keep our minds set on heavenly things instead of on earthly things. And guys, I know that's hard to do because there's a lot of earthly things going on around us in our country today that are very much demanding our attention. It's very, very difficult to put that aside and to just really kind of not play along. I know that there are a lot of people I respect who are recommending that we kind of do a media fast and not engage in all the discord that is happening, and just not get sucked into it, because our focus should be on heavenly things. A friend was telling me about a group of women that she met with last week in a small group, and the discussion was completely centered on what's going on in the culture, what certain religious leaders are saying about it, and what they agree with and what they disagree with, to the degree that the purpose of the small group to grow in their faith was completely overlooked. And my friend left very discouraged by having been to that meeting. And so there's such a need for us to set our minds on heavenly things instead of on the earthly things, because it will get us all tripped up. But because if we are linked to Christ and identify with Him and with His lifestyle and morality, then we have incredibly positive benefits in our life with Christ. And so that should impact the way we view the culture and the way we view our own selves and our place in the culture. So how does having a heavenly mindset or a heavenly focus affect the way we live? Well, it's a lot easier said than done. D.L. Moody addressed the fact that we live in this world, but we shouldn't be of the world. He said that a ship sits in the ocean and navigates through that water, but if the ship begins to take on seawater, it will sink. So you see, the point here is we can't leave this world yet until God takes us home. But in the meantime, we've got to be very, very careful that we don't take the world into our lives. Even the attempts to solve the world's problems when we get together is not the way we should be dealing with the world. And I want you to also remember that when we looked at verses 1 through 4, those verses are the solution to the problem that Paul mentioned in chapter 2, verse 23, that very last sentence that said, we need help restraining our own sensual indulgences. So chapter 3 then began with the reminder that the power we need in order to restrain our flesh nature comes from our realization of the facts that we died with Christ to our old life when we were born again. And the power that raised Jesus from the dead and seated Him at the right hand of God is what gives us power over our fleshly indulgences. Now, just to bring it back to the current culture, fleshly indulgences could involve just the arguing and the anger that some of us might feel rising inside of us as we encounter someone who disagrees with us, or just watch the news and it gets us all riled up to the point of a sinful mindset and attitude that Paul is going to tell us that we need to do away with. So let's just look at some of those fleshly indulgences that Paul mentions. It's not a complete list, but it's definitely a lot of what we are all needing to deal with. So he starts in verse 5 and says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you once walked, okay, before you were a Christian, when you were living in them. But now you must put them all away. Such things as anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Don't lie to one another, seeing that you've put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its Creator. Here there's not Greek or Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. Now, Paul tells us, first off, to put these things to death. We're going to look at how to do that in a little bit later in the lesson. But for now, just to notice the intensity of this command, put to death. So be thinking, what would it mean to put to death these specific sins, these specific things that are characteristic of the unsaved person? But he's clearly speaking to the saved person, saying that these are things that you once lived with, very cavalierly lived with these things, but now you need to put them to death. We've got sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed, anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language, lies, and dishonesty. Now, the first four in the list have to do with everything from adultery and fornication to pornography and lust. And, I don't think I actually need to belabor. We know what these are. But I have to just tell you something that just happened. Last week, there was a friend that called us and said they were in town and wanted to just get together for a little bit. So we just got together for coffee. And they came over to the house, and it was so interesting because it was a couple, and they're Christians, but they're not married. They are living together. Well, not living together, but they're kind of shacking up, okay? And, his wife had died recently, and so he needs companionship, and she was a wonderful friend, and so now they are shacking up. Okay, Paul calls this sexual immorality. Sexual immorality covers everything from adultery and fornication to, any kind of sex outside of the bonds of marriage. But the point I wanted to make about this couple is that they were so clearly nervous. They knew that what they were doing was wrong. They're Christians. And the Holy Spirit was causing them to be uncomfortable as they were meeting with us who knew them from previous days. And it was very interesting to see how uncomfortable they were, because they were doing what Paul is saying that they needed to put to death. Now, Paul is definitely not going to stop with just those particular things. The rest of this list deals with how we relate to each other in other ways in the world. They aren't the way Jesus would have lived. Let's look at them again. Evil desires and greed, anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy lies, filthy language, and lying to one another, and dishonesty. But this is not the way Jesus would have lived. And since we identify with Jesus, we shouldn't be caught up in living this way. The old saying that was popular back in the 90s, what would Jesus do, should be our pattern as believers. Jesus indwells us. Therefore, we let his Spirit be evident in our lifestyle. But Paul makes this even stronger when he says in verse 6, because of these sins, the wrath of God is coming. Now, let's consider what that means. It's a very shocking statement if you stop and think about it, that the wrath of God is coming because of those sins. So let's look at what that means. Now, the word in the Greek for wrath is orge. It's derived from the idea of something that swells until it becomes so swollen that it bursts forth. Now, that is just a generic understanding of the word. And that is what we picture when we see people lose their temper. It's just, their face starts getting red and you can see this swelling inside them, and it finally bursts forth. God's wrath is not like that. It's not a petulant outburst like humans, like we're so prone to. But it's an anger that proceeds from God's settled nature. We make ourselves, men and women, make ourselves the object of God's wrath when we sin and become a part of the destructiveness of evil. The concept of wrath includes God's present displeasure with evil, as well as the ultimate confinement and defeat for all evil in eternal hell. Now, let me repeat this. The wrath that is coming from God is his settled indignation and controlled, passionate feelings against sin. Okay? And God, in his holiness, in his purity, in his righteousness, has every right to express his wrath against the sin that is so prevalent in our world today. Now, this wrath that is coming is going to be directed against the ungodly. All right? It is not going to be directed against the Christian, like the couple I was telling you about, because they've been saved, their sins have been forgiven, but they shouldn't be walking in them, okay? They should kill that. But the wrath that is coming is going to be directed against the ungodly. But since that is so, and since that is such the sin is such an offense to God, as Christians, Paul is saying to us, don't live like that. You have died to your old life. You have been raised to newness of life. So put it to death. Any residual kinds of things in your life that were a pattern in your previous unsaved life, put those things to death. Let's see, let me move on. Verse 9 in that passage reminds us that these sins should not be part of us because they represent who we were before we knew Christ. Just what we've already said, he says, don't do these things because you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self. So we're going to talk about that, what that looks like and how it's done in just a few minutes. But finally, in this section, in verse 11, Paul says, here, in other words, here in the new creation with Christians side by side living in community, there is no Jew or Greek, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and is in all. And the only point I want to make about that, because that's a whole lesson about racism, about discrimination, and discrimination of any kind. That's another lesson. But the point here is that because we are a new creation, racism should never be seen among Christians. That should never, ever happen. So we'll talk about that another time. All right, let's move on to this list of new habits. We're to put off those old sins. But I want us to look at the alternative that Paul is going to mention now in 12 through 14, because here's the something that I want to just point out, and it's not going to be really the main topic until next week, but the essence of Christianity is not that we no longer sin. The essence of Christianity is that we live a life that points others to Jesus, a life that is full of the things that are mentioned in this next session. And so I'm sorry that I'm having to be so negative in this lesson and point out the sins that we need to put to death. But that's the way Paul wrote it, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But next week's lesson will be so much more fun because it's going to speak of these things that we should be doing. Now, another interesting thing that was observed yesterday, as one of the women at the Sykes group was walking in, there was a gentleman sitting on a bench outside the door, and he said, "Are you going to the Bible study?" And so obviously he knew that there was a Bible study taking place inside Sykes Grocery. And so she said yes, and he began to just talk about how he once used to go to church and how he quit because the people began to see him as someone that didn't belong. And so this next section that we'll be looking at is something that we desperately need to practice. We need to put these things on. Just as we take off the old sins, take off the old man or woman, and put those things aside, we need to put on the new. But let's read those things. This is Colossians 3:12 through 14. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you. So you must also forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Now, isn't that beautiful? It's such a beautiful list. But what I want you to notice is just how Paul addresses us, you and I. He says, you are chosen. You are holy. You are much loved. What a beautiful thing to say about us. To think of that's your identity. You are chosen. You are holy. You are much loved, dearly loved. And so he says, therefore, because this is who you are, put on compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, etc., etc. So how does this happen? How do you take off the first section and put on the new? I mean, is it like taking off an old coat and putting on a new one? Well, the implication is that it is exactly that. To take off the old clothes and put on the new clothes. But the idea is very much take it off and don't put it back on. You've taken it off and you have permanently applied the new clothing. You know, I like to clean out my closet every spring and fall. And so as I was preparing for this lesson and reading through it was last week as I was just reading through this passage, thinking about working on the lesson itself, I was in my closet doing some straightening and organizing because it's fall and, winter clothes are needing to be shifted around to the more prominent place. And I was remembering last fall when I did this, I ended up with a box of clothes that I wanted to get rid of. And so I put them in the back of my car. And wouldn't you know it, I drove past the Salvation Army donation store so many times. And just I would forget that I had that box of clothes in the back of the car. And finally, I remembered it. And so I pulled into the parking lot, and I before I pulled up to the place where you donate the clothes, I just decided I need to just remember what did I put in this box? And I found a shirt, and I'm like, oh, why did I put that in the box? I kind of like that shirt. And then I found a pair of shoes, and I'm like, oh, they don't really fit very well, but they sure are cute. And so I pulled those two things out and decided, I think I'm going to keep those. Now, there was nothing wrong in doing that. There was nothing sinful in doing that. But I thought, how much like us and our sin nature that experience was. Because we tend to think of taking off the old and putting on the new. But okay, I might hold on to a few of the old things because, in certain situations, those things would fit better, they would work better. I kind of need those things from time to time. I need to pull those out and put on that hat or put on those shoes because of something that might come up. And that was just very, that was a strong memory for me of literally doing that with clothing as I was preparing this lesson. And such a very indicting picture of how we view the flesh nature of our own selves, our flesh nature that flares up in so many ways. And Paul is telling us, take it off, remove it, put it to death. Now, let's move on to some of the ways that we can actually do that in our walk with Christ. It starts with a mindset. It starts by being encouraged that the old me is decisively dead. We've read it in Colossians already. We saw in Colossians 2, verse 12, that we've been buried with him in baptism and then raised with him through faith into the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. So there's that truth that we need to cling to. Then the one we read earlier in Colossians 3, verse 3, for you died, the old you died, and your life now is hidden with Christ in God. So it's dead. And then look at Romans 6, verses 5 and 6. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. Or still in Romans 6, skipping down to verse 11. So you also must consider yourselves dead to sin, but alive to God in Jesus Christ. Do not let sin reign in your mortal body, reign or rule, to make you obey its passions. Do not present your members to sin as instruments for righteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments of righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. So you see there, Paul is just reminding us again that we are to consider ourselves dead to sin. consider is like reckon, to make that your mental reality. Now, the sin nature is still there, but mentally we are to reckon ourselves dead to sin, to just consider it, to look at it, to look at the old self nature, to look at it as being a thing of the past, that it's dead. So that mindset is very important in being able to have victory over these things that want to pop up in our lives. And I say pop up. Pop up is something like that anger that bursts forth. But to make a decision as a believer that, okay, I am going to shack up with this man that I'm not married to, that didn't pop up. That is something that was very deliberately decided. But he says, don't do it. Don't present your members, in other words, the parts of your body, to sin, because that is unrighteousness. But rather present yourselves to God. Offer yourself, offer your body parts, offer the flesh nature to God. Ephesians 4 says it similarly. Ephesians 4:22-24. Put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and be renewed. Be renewed in the spirit of your minds. Put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. This idea of being renewed in the spirit of your minds is what we've been doing in our study of the knowledge of God. The more we increase our knowledge of God and of Jesus Christ who indwells us, the more we're going to have the ability and the power to live this life as a new creature, to walk forward in newness of life, created after the likeness of God. Romans 8:12-13. So then, brothers, we're debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. Because if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. You know, that's a strong statement in verse 13. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. As a Christian, he's saying that if we indulge in the old nature, there will be something in us that just dies. The Holy Spirit in us is going to be so quenched, so suppressed, because it's unconfessed sin. And that will really just kill that love and that exuberance that you hopefully currently have for Jesus Christ. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, and we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. This comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. Some of you listening may receive the devotional that we give out at the Bible study. And it's so interesting that today's devotional speaks of this, and it has that specific passage from 2 Corinthians 3 in the devotional. So I want to read the comment that follows that passage. The writer says, God isn't interested in improved flesh. In his eyes, improved flesh is still just flesh. He's in the character transformation business, not the self-improvement business. All your self-improvement strategies can't transform your old self nature. Only God, by the Spirit's power, can make you more Christ-like. As you behold and look at and study, as in a mirror, the Word of God, you become transformed into the same image, the image of God. The image of God you're looking at in the mirror, from glory to glory. It doesn't happen because of your grit, but because of His grace. So, what will happen to my flesh, you might ask? God's ultimate plan is to replace it and give you a new heavenly body. That's why Paul writes, throw off your old sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Don't alter, don't adjust, or patch up. We got to throw it away. Like a lobster that grows and sheds the confinement of its old shell, as you focus on and fellowship with Christ, you are released from the dominance of your old nature and grow into your new one. You're transformed from the inside out. Now, there are a lot more passages that we could look at. I want to say there's several passages that really get very specific about what we need to do. We're to hate evil. Romans 12:9 says, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. So to develop a strong distaste for that sin that still resides, and to just do whatever it takes. Romans 13:14 says, make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. In other words, plan your life, plan your day in such a way that you're not going to fall for a temptation. One of my favorite analogies to this, which is very old, is don't go to Krispy Kreme donuts to drink coffee if you're trying to lose weight. I mean, how stupid is that? You can pick up in a drive-thru a cup of coffee. Don't put yourself in the position, don't put yourself in front of Krispy Kreme donuts if you're trying to put off the old nature of gluttony. Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, gouge out your eye, cut off your hand. Now, girls, don't misunderstand. Jesus is no way saying to mutilate your body. Okay? He's not into cutting, right? He is simply saying, do whatever it takes. Have a mentality and an attitude towards that old sinful nature that is so deliberate and so committed to making the changes happen. Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Now, the mind needs to be renewed. There's no question about it. That's exactly what I've been saying about our previous studies on the character and nature of God, is that the more we renew our mind, we will have victory over sin. Romans 8:5. Those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Girls, where is your mind? Where are you setting your mind? Philippians 4:8 says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And then I love Ezekiel 36:27. He says, I will put my spirit in you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey all my rules. Girls, God's given us everything we need for life and godliness. He has given us everything we need to defeat sin in our lives. We must live it. We must walk in it. We must be intentional about it. So keep your minds in the heavenlies. See you next week.